Hello, my dear. I'm Anastasia, and welcome to Anastasia's Whisper, a quiet place where sleepless minds can drift through history's shadows with a touch of irony and a sprinkle of wonder. Tonight, we're unraveling one of history's most curious compliments, the idea of blue blood. Sounds strange, doesn't it? Almost like a fairy tale, as if kings and queens had veins filled with liquid sapphire, or as if somewhere in a palace, a queen reclined under golden light while her skin shimmered like porcelain, delicate rivers of blue running just beneath. The phrase blue blood is everywhere today, tossed casually into novels, whispered about royalty, even used to describe families who've been wealthy for so long that they practically feel fictional. But where did it actually come from? And why did it matter so much that for centuries, noble families pointed to the veins in their wrists as proof of superiority? The story begins in medieval Spain, but it doesn't stay there. It wanders through the courts of France, glides into the powdered faces of England, flirts with Venetian beauty tricks, and eventually drifts into Victorian novels where azure veins became symbols of tragic heroines. Along the way, we'll meet queens who painted their veins, painters who exaggerated them, and doctors who tried, and mostly failed, to explain them. So settle in. Pull the blankets higher, close your eyes if you wish, and let me tell you the real story of why the royals were said to have blue blood. Let's go back, together, to Spain in the late 1400s. Close your eyes and picture it, a fortress city of Castile, its towers rising above a dry plain, its streets echoing with the clatter of hooves and the cries of merchants. The air is warm, heavy with dust and spice. Church bells mark the hours, and banners hang limp in the still evening air. This was Spain at a crossroads, a country on the brink of becoming a kingdom, a land still shaped by centuries of Muslim rule, yet now reforging its identity under Christian monarchs. And for the nobles of Castile, one question haunted everything. How pure is your blood? You see, in those tense decades, ancestry became a weapon. Nobles claimed their families had never mixed with Jews, or with Muslims, or with anyone outside the ideal Christian line. They called this proud distinction limpieza de sangre, the cleanliness of blood. But here's the curious part. How could you ever prove something like that? There were no DNA tests, no tidy genealogical records stretching back to the Visigoths. At best, there were dusty parchments in monastery libraries, family legends told over wine, or the testimony of a priest who probably had his own biases. So the nobles found another way, and it was right there on their skin. The aristocrats of Castile lived behind thick stone walls, beneath shaded courtyards, beneath silk awnings that filtered the sun. Their lives were lived indoors, reading poetry, arranging marriages, hosting feasts. They did not plow. They did not harvest. They did not tan under the same sun that browned the backs of peasants. And so their skin remained pale, almost translucent, and on that pale skin, especially along the inner arms, the veins stood out clearly, a fragile web of blue just beneath the surface. Peasants, of course, had no such luxury. Their skin was marked by the sun, darkened and toughened from endless labor. They had strong arms and calloused hands, but no delicate blue tracery to show. And in that contrast, in that small accident of biology, the nobles saw their proof. Their veins, they declared, were visible because their blood was different, bluer, purer, higher. They even had a phrase for it, sangre azul, blue blood. The phrase caught on quickly. Chroniclers in Castile began to write about it with reverence. One noted that the noble ladies of Spain glow with whiteness, their veins like threads of heaven beneath their skin. Another praised noblemen whose arms bore the clear blue marks of their lineage, proof that they are not of common stock. And so a simple observation, pale skin shows veins more clearly, became a symbol of superiority. Imagine it, a marketplace in Toledo. The stalls are crowded with baskets of figs, bolts of wool, jars of honey. A noblewoman, veiled and perfumed, pauses to inspect a piece of cloth. A merchant's wife, standing beside her, has arms darkened by years of outdoor work. And then, the noblewoman adjusts her sleeve ever so slightly, revealing the underside of her wrist. Pale, translucent, a vein glimmering faintly beneath the candlelight. No words are exchanged. None are needed. The message is clear. I am not like you. My blood is blue. Of course, the science of it, which we know today, is nothing so dramatic. Blood is always red. Veins only appear blue because of the way light travels through skin. But in a world hungry for visible proof of difference, this little trick of optics became a banner of privilege. And from Castile, the myth began to travel, carried by poets, by envoys, by artists who painted the nobility with veins that glowed just a little too vividly. Soon, France, England, and Italy would all take up the obsession, turning pale skin and visible veins into an art form, and sometimes even a farce. But the root of it all was here, in Spain, where a pale wrist could carry as much authority as a royal seal. From Spain, the idea of sangre azul did not remain locked within stone castles. Like fine silk on a trade ship, it traveled, drifting across courts, whispered by ambassadors, repeated in love poems, and painted into portraits. Before long, much of Europe had become enchanted with the notion that nobility could be read, quite literally, in the veins. France, unsurprisingly, was first to embrace the drama. The French court had always loved a performance, and what better stage than the human body? Imagine the Louvre in the late 1500s. The halls are crowded with courtiers in velvet doublets and towering ruffs, the air thick with candle smoke and perfume. Noblewomen sit side by side, their faces powdered ghostly white with ceruse, a deadly mix of lead and vinegar that gave them a porcelain glow while quietly ruining their skin. But the powder was only the first act. The second, the veins. Fashionable ladies took tiny brushes dipped in bluish paint and drew delicate lines across their temples, down their necks, and along their hands. By candlelight, it made their skin seem translucent, their bodies fragile, almost glass-like. Guests whispered that they looked as though they were spun from crystal, breakable, ethereal. It was absurd, of course, but absurdity never stopped fashion. An English envoy visiting Paris described these women as brittle statues come to life, as if one touch might cause their veins to spill their noble essence onto the floor. He was half mocking, half dazzled, but either way, he remembered it. And so did everyone else. The men joined in too. Nobles powdered their faces, and some even enhanced the veins on their hands before attending court. Picture a duke adjusting his lace cuff, casually ensuring that his wrist showed a faint blue shimmer. His blood was as good as a title, and everyone could see it. Across the Channel, England was developing its own obsession. Elizabethan England adored pale skin. Queen Elizabeth herself turned her complexion into a political symbol, layering on thick white makeup, the infamous Venetian cerusse, until her face looked as pale as carved marble. To her subjects, the Queen's whiteness was a symbol of divinity, untouchable and pure. But in private, cracks formed. Literally. The lead-based makeup was corrosive. At court banquets, if she smiled too widely, the paint split in fine lines. Yet this only added to the strange mystique. The Virgin Queen, both eternal and fragile, her very face a mask of sovereignty. The women of her court copied her style, avoiding the sun with near religious devotion. Parasols became fashionable accessories, wide-brimmed hats, elbow-length gloves, and even long veils served as shields against any hint of tan. A suntan was social death. To have color in your cheeks was to admit you worked outdoors. To be pale, veined, and fragile was to be blue-blooded. Poets noticed. Shakespeare himself, in his sonnets, praised ladies with azure veins winding beneath pale skin, comparing them to rivers beneath ivory fields. Love, at least in poetry, was always pale and faintly bluish. And then there was Venice. Ah, Venice, a city already addicted to illusions. Here, the cult of the vain became a form of seduction. Imagine a salon by the Grand Canal. The walls are gilded, the air thick with incense and lute music. A noble woman reclines in a chair of carved walnut, her arm draped loosely over silk cushions. Her face is powdered, her lips tinted with rouge, and faint bluish lines trace her temples and throat. As the evening drifts on, she begins to slide her lace glove from her wrist. Slowly, deliberately, she reveals the pale underside of her arm, a delicate network of veins glowing in candlelight. It is not a coincidence. It is a performance, a carefully staged gesture meant to dazzle. Men lean forward. Poets reach for their quills. She has spoken no words, and yet the message is clear. My blood is blue. Do you see? For Venetian noblewomen, veins were not just symbols of purity. They were tools of allure, and they worked. But with every obsession comes satire. Not everyone admired the fashion. Italian satirists wrote verses about ladies who spent more time painting their veins than attending to their prayers. In France, pamphlets mocked women who appeared so pale and delicate that one sneeze might scatter them like dust. And in England, playwrights slipped jokes into comedies about noblemen whose veins seemed more painted than pulsing. Still, the ridicule never killed the trend. If anything, it gave it more life. Because by then, the visible vein was more than a fashion statement. It was a social signal. To show your veins was to declare, I do not work. I am not burned by the sun. I am set apart, delicate, rare. It was theater. It was propaganda. It was vanity turned into currency. And Europe could not get enough of it. Here's where the whole idea of blue blood becomes even stranger, because you and I know something the people of the Middle Ages did not. Blood isn't blue. It never was. But to them, the explanation was far less obvious and far more dramatic. Imagine being a doctor in the year 1500. Your medical kit is a brass bowl, a jar of leeches, and a book copied from Galen, a physician who had died more than 1,000 years earlier. If someone fainted, you blamed their black bile. If someone coughed, you muttered about yellow bile. And if someone pointed at their arm and said, "Look, my veins are blue," well, you nodded seriously and wrote it down in Latin. There was no concept of oxygenation, no neat diagrams of red versus blue circulation like you'd see in a modern textbook. Instead, doctors believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Veins, they thought, carried the cooler, calmer blood, aristocratic blood. Arteries, by contrast, carried the fiery, restless red stuff that made peasants so robust, so sweaty, and in their view, so terribly common. So when nobles pointed proudly to the delicate rivers under their skin, physicians didn't laugh. They agreed. Of course, noble blood looked different. It had to. Otherwise, how would the hierarchy of the world make sense? Now imagine a scholar in Salamanca hunched over his desk by candlelight. He dips his quill and scribbles a note in the margin. Azure veins, a sign of divine balance. His hands are ink-stained. The air smells faintly of wax. And outside, peasants tramp home from the fields with faces browned by the sun. Their veins are hidden. His notes, though wrong, seem perfectly logical. And here's the delicious irony. Soldiers and surgeons knew better. On battlefields, when a sword cut through skin, when a cannonball shattered bone, there was no blue. Blood spilled bright red into the dust. Surgeons amputating a leg saw red, not sapphire. But no one wanted to hear from the barber with a saw. Authority rested in the scholar with a book. So the myth persisted. Poets praised azure veins in their verses. Painters dabbed a little ultramarine on noble wrists to flatter their patrons. Doctors scribbled earnest nonsense about refined blood flowing in the nobility. And nobles? They believed every word. What nobody knew, and what makes this whole story quietly hilarious, is that the explanation was simple physics. Veins only appear blue because of the way light scatters in the skin. Blood is always red. Always. But medieval Europe preferred its fantasy. Blue veins meant destiny. Blue veins meant difference. It wasn't science. It was theater disguised as anatomy, and it lasted for centuries. If words weren't enough to convince people that noble blood was blue, art was happy to step in and finish the job, because once painters and portraitists got involved, veins didn't just show up by accident. They were carefully arranged, highlighted, and even invented with a brush. Imagine standing in a dimly lit hall of a Spanish palace in the 16th century. A great canvas hangs above the fireplace. A nobleman in gleaming armor, his face pale as ivory, his arm resting casually on a table. If you look closely, you notice something curious. Along his hand, the artist has brushed faint streaks of blue-green, delicate veins that seem to glow against his skin. It is not an accident. It is not even subtle. The artist has made sure you will see them, because those lines are not anatomy. They are propaganda. The Habsburgs, masters of political image, adored this trick. Court painters were encouraged to exaggerate pallor and veins to make their sitters look more refined. A little dab of ultramarine along the temple, a faint tracery on the wrist, enough to suggest that here was no ordinary man. Here was someone whose very blood whispered superiority. In France, the Bourbons carried the performance further. Portraits of noblewomen were almost dreamlike, powdered faces glowing, necks elongated, skin so pale it seemed translucent. Veins weren't just painted, they were celebrated. Some artists gave their subjects a porcelain glow with faint blue rivers winding across the chest or hands, as if to say, "Behold, this is not mere flesh. This is lineage on display." And in England, painters of the Tudor and Stuart courts followed suit. Look at portraits of Queen Elizabeth I. Behind the pearls and lace, her skin has been painted with an eerie whiteness, her features sharp, her body almost inhumanly pale. In some versions, faint veins appear near her temples, as though her head were carved of marble and light shone straight through it. It was a calculated effect. Elizabeth's authority rested partly on her image. Untouchable, eternal, different. And what better way to show her difference than with blood that looked as though it belonged to no ordinary human? Of course, this wasn't limited to queens and kings. Aristocrats across Europe hired artists to immortalize them, and artists knew the rules of flattery. Give the nobleman a commanding pose, give the lady a luminous glow, and never forget the veins. Always the veins. Imagine the moment. A painter sits in a chilly studio in Venice. Before him, a countess sits motionless in her chair, her gown rustling faintly. He squints, dips his brush, and adds the finishing touch, a faint blue line just visible at her wrist. The countess glances down, nods approvingly. She knows her grandchildren will see this painting and understand. We are blue-blooded. It is written on the body. The irony, of course, is that many of these portraits were more invention than truth. Some nobles weren't pale at all. Some spent time outdoors hunting or hawking. Some were ruddy-faced, hearty, flushed with wine. But art was not meant to record reality. It was meant to broadcast an ideal. And the ideal was clear. Nobility was delicate, veined, and gloriously separate from the peasantry. Over time, this artistic exaggeration fed back into culture. People saw portraits of noble women glowing with veins like porcelain dolls, and assumed this was reality. The painted illusion became its own proof. If the painting shows it, it must be true. And so, across Europe, blue blood became not just a phrase, not just a whispered claim, but an image burned into the collective imagination. Even today, if you picture a medieval or Renaissance queen, what comes to mind? Pale skin, delicate hands, perhaps a faint shimmer of veins. The art did its job well. It is almost poetic. The way propaganda seeps into brushstrokes, how a touch of blue pigment on canvas could shape centuries of belief. And all the while, the peasants in the fields laughed quietly to themselves, because they knew that when the nobleman cut his hand, what spilled onto the ground was not sapphire, but red. Always red. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the phrase "born into" had spread so widely that it no longer needed explanation. Everyone knew what it meant. In Spain, in France, in England, across the entire map of Europe, blue blood was simply another way to say born into the aristocracy. But the world itself was changing. The old order of fields and fortresses was giving way to empires, industry, and cities, humming with coal and commerce. The nobility still clung to their veins, but their supremacy was no longer as unquestioned as it had been in Castile. Imagine a grand English country house in the early 1800s. A noble family sits for tea, the women pale in silk gowns, the men flushed from fox hunting. They are described in the newspapers as blue-blooded, a phrase that now suggests not just pale veins, but ancient privilege. Across the Atlantic, in America, the term has crossed the ocean too. A Bostonian merchant, wealthy from trade, sneers at his rival and calls him blue blood, meaning arrogant, born into money. The phrase had slipped its Spanish roots and become global. In literature, blue blood became a convenient shorthand. Victorian novelists loved it. A heroine might be described as fragile, pale, her blue blood betraying noble stock. A pompous lord might be mocked for clinging to his blue-blooded heirs. The phrase could flatter or satirize, but it was always understood. Meanwhile, the obsession with veins had not entirely faded. In the glittering ballrooms of Paris and London, pale skin was still a status marker. Industrial soot darkened the faces of workers in factories, while aristocrats sheltered behind curtains of velvet and silk. For the wealthy, whiteness of skin and the faint shimmer of veins were not just fashion. They were the last surviving signs of the old order. Of course, satire followed closely behind. In Victorian magazines, cartoonists lampooned noblemen as a feat, sickly figures with exaggerated blue veins, fainting at the sight of work. The irony was sharp. The aristocrats wanted their veins to prove strength, but by the 19th century, they sometimes seemed proof only of fragility. And yet the romance of it lingered. Painters still gave noble ladies that faint blue tint. Poets still wrote of ivory skin with azure rivers. And society still whispered about families whose bloodlines were as old as the castles they lived in. By the late Victorian era, blue blood no longer required visible veins at all. The phrase had detached itself from the body entirely. You could be ruddy, tanned, or flushed with port wine. But if your family tree reached back far enough, you were still blue-blooded. The image of pale skin with glowing veins remained in the imagination, but it had become symbolic, not literal. It is curious, isn't it? What began as a trick of the eye in medieval Spain, a pale wrist with a visible vein, had become by the 19th century a metaphor, a label, a cultural shorthand for privilege itself. And even today, the phrase survives. When we speak of someone as blue-blooded, we rarely think of veins or pale skin. We think of lineage, of privilege, of being born into a world where status is inherited rather than earned. The veins have faded, the metaphor remains. And so, the story of blue blood comes full circle. What began in medieval Spain as a boast of purity, what spread through France as painted veins, what shimmered in portraits and echoed in poetry, has drifted into our language as nothing more than a phrase with no real science, just a strange, beautiful illusion that once convinced half of Europe that privilege flowed in azure streams beneath their skin. The truth, of course, is simple. Blood is red. It always was, and always will be. The veins only seem blue because of light and skin and the tricks of the eye. But people of the past, oh, how they loved their illusions. And sometimes, perhaps, illusions are easier to live with than the truth. So tonight, as you rest in your bed, safe, warm, far from painted powders and courtly vanities, you can smile at the thought of nobles who powdered their faces until they cracked, who painted little blue rivers on their arms, who hired painters to exaggerate the veins in their portraits, all to prove that they were different. But in the end, they were not. Their blood was the same, their hearts beat the same, their fears and hopes were the same. And just like us, they closed their eyes each night, uncertain of tomorrow. That is the quiet secret history never says out loud. Kings, queens, peasants, and merchants all carried the same red tide in their veins. The blue was only ever an illusion. So as you let yourself sink into the softness of the present moment, let the old illusion fade away. No powdered skin, no parasols, no pressure to prove yourself by the shade of a vein. Your blood runs red, your dreams run deep, and your worth is not in ancestry or appearances. It is in simply being here, alive, breathing, resting. Tonight, you are royalty in the only way that matters. Crowned with peace, robed in quiet, resting in safety. The world outside can wait. The court is dismissed. The candles are low. And your only duty now is to close your eyes and drift into sleep. Good night.